I stopped explaining, not dramatically, not after a fight, just stopped. One Tuesday morning. Didn't justify why I'd bought the towels I'd bought. Didn't explain why I'd taken the route I'd taken home. Didn't defend why I'd chosen the restaurant I'd chosen. Just stopped. Within 24 hours, everything collapsed. He didn't ask what I needed. He asked why I didn't explain. By Friday night, the house was silent. Not because I left, not because I yelled, not because I did anything except stop performing the one thing that had been holding the relationship together for 6 years. Constant explanation, and the silence that followed my refusal to explain showed me exactly what the relationship was built on. Nothing, just my willingness to justify my existence. I spent 6 years explaining every choice, every decision, every preference like I was on trial, like every action required defense, like my right to make decisions depended on my ability to justify them to someone who would never be satisfied with the justification. And the day I stopped explaining, the day I just said this is what I chose without defending why I chose it, the entire system collapsed, revealed itself as built entirely on my performance. My justification, my constant accountability to someone who had made himself judge of every choice I made. I'm 51, I left 3 years ago, and it took me 2 years to understand that the explaining wasn't communication, wasn't partnership, wasn't me being considerate. It was the mechanism, was what kept me controlled, was how he maintained authority over my choices without ever explicitly demanding it. The moment I stopped explaining, the moment I stopped justifying, the moment I just existed autonomously without constant defense, there was nothing left, no relationship underneath, just the expectation that I would explain and the collapse when I didn't. I didn't recognize it as auditing. I thought he'd be annoyed. I didn't expect what he actually did. If you've ever explained simple decisions like they required defense, if you've justified basic choices to someone who'd never accept the justification, if you've spent hours defending why you did something that didn't require defense, if you've realized you can't make a choice without preparing the explanation for it, you already know what I'm describing. You already know the exhaustion of constant justification, the weight of perpetual accountability, the feeling that your right to decide depends on your ability to explain. And I'm realizing, as I tell you this, some of you are explaining yourselves right now, constantly, exhaustingly preparing defenses for basic choices. So here's what I need to know. What do you explain that shouldn't require explanation? Just drop it in the comments. I explain blank. Let's see if we're all defending the same normal things. I spent 6 years thinking the explaining was respect, was partnership, was good communication. It wasn't. It was submission. And I didn't see it until I stopped. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened. The Tuesday morning, the choice to stop, the 24 hours that showed me what 6 years had been built on. We'd been together 6 years, married for 3, both in our late 40s when we met, both divorced. Both thought we knew what healthy relationships looked like. He seemed thoughtful, seemed interested in understanding my reasoning. Asked a lot of questions about why I did things, why I chose what I chose, why I thought the way I thought. I interpreted the questions as care, as genuine interest, as him wanting to understand me. I didn't recognize it as auditing. Year 1, the questions became constant. Why did you buy this brand of coffee instead of that one? Why did you take this route home instead of the highway? Why did you call your sister on Tuesday instead of waiting until the weekend? Every choice came with questions. Not casual questions, detailed questions. Questions that required answers, required justification, required me to defend the reasoning behind decisions that didn't need defense. I started preparing explanations before making choices. Would decide something and immediately formulate why I decided it. The reasoning, the logic, the defense. Would think through how I'd explain it when he asked, because he always asked every single choice, every decision, every preference. All required explanation. Year 2, I realized I couldn't buy anything without anxiety. Couldn't choose something at the store without mentally preparing the defense. Couldn't make any decision without constructing the explanation I'd need to provide. The explaining had become automatic, had become part of every choice. Wasn't deciding and then explaining, was explaining while deciding. The explanation was inseparable from the choice itself. I bought new towels, blue ones. He got home, saw them. Said, "Why'd you get blue? We have perfectly good towels." I said I wanted new ones. These were on sale. I liked the color. He said, "But why blue? Why not white like what we had? Blue shows stains, doesn't match the bathroom." I said they were the color I wanted. He said, "But that doesn't make sense. White is more practical. Why would you choose something less practical?" I spent 10 minutes explaining towels. 10 minutes defending why I'd chosen blue towels. 10 minutes justifying a simple purchase that was my choice to make. And when the conversation ended, when he finally seemed satisfied with my explanation, I felt exhausted, drained, like I'd been through an interrogation about towels. About blue towels. That was the moment I started documenting it, started keeping track of what I explained, how often, how long. Started counting the explanations I provided for choices that didn't require explanation. Week 1, 17 explanations. 17 separate instances of defending basic choices. Why I'd parked where I'd parked. Why I'd bought the groceries I'd bought. Why I'd suggested the movie I'd suggested. Why I'd chosen to wear what I'd worn. 17 times in 7 days, I explained decisions that were mine to make. That's when it hit me. I wasn't in a partnership. I was in a courtroom. And I was the only one on trial. Year 3, my daughter visited. Watched us for a weekend, afterward pulled me aside. Said, "Mom, do you notice how much you explain yourself to him?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Everything. You explain everything. Why you chose the restaurant. Why you suggested the activity. Why you made the choice you made. You spend so much time justifying basic decisions. It's exhausting to watch." I said, "I'm just communicating, just sharing my reasoning." She said, "No, you're defending, you're justifying. You're explaining things that don't require explanation." And he sits there like a judge deciding if your reasoning is acceptable. Like he has authority over your choices, like your decisions need his approval to be valid. She saw it clearly. I'd become someone who couldn't make a choice without explaining why I'd made it, without justifying it, without defending it to someone who'd positioned himself as arbiter of whether my reasoning was sound. Year 4, I tried making choices without explaining them. Small test. Bought different brand of yogurt. Didn't explain why. He noticed. Said, "This is different yogurt?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why'd you switch?" I said, "Just wanted to try something different." He said, "But you've been buying the other brand for months. What made you decide to switch?" I felt the familiar pressure, the expectation and explanation. Said, "I don't know, just felt like a change." He said, "That seems random. You usually have a reason for changes like this." I felt myself starting to explain, starting to provide justification, caught myself. Said, "It's just yogurt. I wanted to try a different kind." He said, "I'm not saying you can't buy different yogurt. I'm just asking why, trying to understand your reasoning." I said, "There's no deep reasoning. I just chose it." The conversation continued for 5 more minutes. Him asking why, me resisting the pull to explain. Finally said, "Because I wanted to. That's the reason. I wanted to try it." He said, "You're being defensive. I'm just asking a simple question." I said, "And I'm getting you a simple answer. I wanted to try it. That's why." The rest of the evening was tense, cold. He withdrew. Made it clear he was unhappy. Not with the yogurt. With my refusal to provide the explanation he expected. I'd broken the pattern, refused to justify, and the refusal itself became the problem. Year 5, I realized I could not explain. The explaining was so ingrained, so automatic, so expected, that resisting it felt wrong, Felt like I was being difficult, being uncommunicative, being a bad partner. The explaining had become my normal, had become what I believed partnership required. Couldn't imagine relating any other way. Month 68, something shifted. I was exhausted from work, from life, from 6 years of constant explaining. Made a decision. Told a friend I'd help her move on Saturday. Didn't mention it to him first. Didn't seek his input. Just made the plan. Friday evening, he said, "What are we doing tomorrow?" I said, "I'm helping Sarah move. You can do whatever you'd like." He said, "When were you planning to tell me?" I said, "I'm telling you now." He said, "But you already made the plan, already committed, without discussing it with me." I said it didn't occur to me. I needed to discuss it. He said, "That's the problem. It should occur to you. We're partners. Partners discuss plans before making them." I felt the familiar expectation, the pull to explain, to justify, to defend why I'd made plans without consulting him. And something in me just refused, just stopped. Said I made plans to help a friend, that's all. He said, "But why didn't you mention it earlier? Why didn't you check with me first?" I said, "Did you have plans that required me to be available?" He said, "That's not the point. The point is you didn't check." I looked at him, saw the expectation in his face, the waiting, the assumption that I'd now explain, now justify, now walk through my reasoning and apologize for not including him. And I just didn't. Just said, "I'm helping Sarah move tomorrow. I'll be back in the evening." The silence was immediate, complete. He stared at me, waiting. I could see him, waiting for the explanation that always came, the justification I always provided. I said nothing, just looked at him. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became charged. He said, "That's it. That's all you're going to say." I said, "What else is there to say? I made plans. I'm telling you the plans." He said, "You're not going to explain why you didn't mention it sooner? Why you didn't check with me first?" I said, "No, I'm not going to explain. I made plans with a friend. That's not something that requires explanation." He looked shocked, genuinely shocked, like I'd done something incomprehensible. Said, "I don't understand where this is coming from. This isn't like you. You always explain things. You always share your reasoning." I said, "Maybe I'm tired of explaining every decision I make. Maybe some things don't require explanation." He said, "Partnership requires communication, requires sharing your thought process." I said, "I am communicating. I told you I have plans tomorrow. That is communication. What you're asking for isn't communication. It's justification. It's defense. It's me proving my choices are acceptable to you, and I'm not doing it anymore." The next 24 hours showed me exactly what 6 years had been built on. He didn't speak to me the rest of Friday night, didn't speak Saturday morning. I left to help Sarah, spent the day moving boxes, felt lighter than I'd felt in months, felt free, felt like myself, came home Saturday evening. He wasn't there, texted, no response, called, no answer. He came home around 9, went straight to bedroom, closed door. I tried to talk. He said he needed space, needed to think about whether he could be in a relationship with someone who didn't value his input, didn't include him in decisions, didn't think his feelings mattered. I'd made plans with a friend, and he was questioning the entire relationship because I hadn't explained it, hadn't justified it, hadn't sought his approval first. Sunday morning, I woke up and understood something fundamental. The relationship couldn't function without my constant explanation, my perpetual justification, my willingness to defend every choice. The explaining wasn't just something I did. It was the foundation, was the structure, was what held everything together. Without my performance of that role, without my constant accountability, there was nothing. No actual partnership, no mutual respect, no trust, just the expectation that I would explain and the collapse when I didn't. That week, I stopped explaining other things, stopped justifying my choices, Stopped defending my decisions. Made a choice, stated the choice. Didn't provide the explanation he expected. Every time, the same response. Shock, confusion, anger that I wasn't performing the role he'd come to expect. By Thursday, he said we needed to talk. Said he felt like I'd changed, like I'd become someone else. Someone who didn't care about his feelings, who didn't value his input, who didn't think his opinions mattered. I said I haven't changed. I've just stopped explaining myself constantly. He said that's what partnership is, explaining yourself, sharing your reasoning, including your partner in your thought process. I said no, that's what I was doing. That's what you trained me to do. That's not partnership, that's me defending my right to make choices, and I'm not doing it anymore. He said, if you can't see the difference between communication and what you're doing, if you think you can just make decisions without considering me, then maybe this isn't going to work. I said if the relationship falls apart because I stopped explaining every choice I make, then it was never built on solid ground to begin with. Month 69, I moved out. Told him I couldn't stay in a relationship where my choices required constant justification, where making plans with a friend required a defense, where buying blue towels required 10 minutes of explanation, where every decision came with the expectation that I prove it was the right decision. That wasn't partnership. That was submission. And I was done submitting. He said I was being dramatic. Said everyone in relationships explains their choices. I said there's a difference between sharing and defending, between communicating and justifying. I spent 6 years defending choices that were mine to make, preparing explanations for basic decisions, seeking approval for things that didn't require approval. That's not normal. That's not partnership. And the fact that you can't see the difference tells me everything I need to know. 3 years out, I make choices without explaining them, without justifying them, without defending them. The freedom is still strange, still feels unfamiliar. I catch myself starting to explain, starting to justify, starting to prepare the defense. Have to stop myself. Remind myself that I don't owe anyone an explanation for how I live my life, for the choices I make, for the decisions that are mine to make. I'm learning that healthy relationships include communication, include sharing, include consideration, but don't require constant explanation, constant justification, constant defense of choices. Don't require me to seek approval for decisions that are mine to make. Don't require me to prove my reasoning is sound before I'm allowed to choose. Here's what I desperately wish someone had told me the first time I spent 10 minutes explaining why I bought blue towels. If someone requires constant explanation for your choices, if they need to understand and approve every decision you make, if your choices require their agreement, before they're valid, you're not in a partnership. You're in a dynamic where your autonomy is conditional, where your right to choose depends on your ability to justify. And that's not respect. That's not consideration. That's control disguised as interest, disguised as caring, disguised as wanting to understand. If you're reading this and you're constantly explaining yourself, constantly justifying simple decisions, constantly defending choices that shouldn't require defense, if you're exhausted from perpetual explanation, if you can't make a decision without anxiety about how you'll justify it, if you've realized someone expects constant accountability for your autonomy, you don't owe that. You don't owe anyone an explanation for living your life, for making your choices, for existing as a separate person with your own thoughts and preferences and decisions. If this resonated, if you've realized explaining yourself became your prison, the next video is crucial. It's called He Made Every Good Day Feel Temporary. That was the control. It's about what happens when good days exist, when things feel peaceful, when the relationship feels okay. But there's always this feeling that it won't last, that it's temporary, that any moment it could shift back to cold, and how that uncertainty, that instability, that feeling, that good is always temporary. That's its own kind of control that keeps you trying to maintain the good. Trying to prevent the shift, trying to keep the piece that was never actually secure link is on screen now.